The forest of Everfrost slumbered beneath a blanket of snow so ancient it whispered to itself in the stillness of the night. Towering fir trees stretched their frost-laden arms skyward as if yearning to touch the frozen stars. In this ethereal realm, untouched by mortal hands, the winds carried secrets instead of sounds, and shadows lingered longer than they should. Beneath the boughs of an ancient tree, its roots spiraling into the earth like tendrils of forgotten history, dwelled Illumia. She was no larger than a snowbird, her wings spun from threads of moonlight and frost. Her eyes, pale as winter dawns, glimmered with a quiet wisdom that belied her size. Illumia was not an ordinary fairy. She was a guardian, a protector of a creature whose existence defied the laws of the mortal world. Kaelir emerged from the thicket like a ghost materializing from mist. His silver coat shimmered faintly, as if the moonlight hesitated to touch him fully. His antlers, crystalline and delicate, stretched toward the heavens, catching the faintest glimmers of light and scattering them like a silent symphony. Kaelir was not bound by the forest, but chose to remain, tethered by the unspoken connection he shared with Illumia. Each night, when the world seemed to hold its breath, Kaelir would lift his antlers, and the northern lights would awaken. Swaths of emerald and amethyst unfurled across the sky, painting the darkness with a beauty so profound it silenced even the most restless spirits. The auroras were more than light. They were a melody, a language older than words, speaking to the heart of the forest and the souls of its denizens. Illumia watched as Kaelir performed his celestial duty, her heart swelling with reverence. She had always known her role as his protector, but she felt more like his student. The deer's light was not merely a display of beauty. It was a reminder of balance, of harmony between realms seen and unseen. But balance is fragile, and light inevitably draws the attention of shadows. It began subtly, as all things do. The snow no longer fell as gently, and the trees whispered uneasily among themselves. Illumia felt it first, a chill that was not of the cold, but of the spirit, a tremor in the fabric of the forest. She flew to Kaelir, who stood beneath the rising auroras, his luminous gaze fixed on her as if he too sensed the shift. "We are no longer alone," Illumia murmured, her voice as soft as a breath but heavy with meaning. Kaelir's ears twitched and he turned his head, his nostrils flaring as if seeking a scent carried on an unseen wind. Illumia's wings quivered as she took to the air, her small form barely visible against the dark expanse of the sky. She soared above the treetops, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The snow below gleamed like a field of stars, unbroken save for the occasional shadow of a tree. And then she saw it, a trail. Footprints, shallow but deliberate, carved a path through the snow. They did not belong to any creature of the forest. They were the marks of intruders, hunters. Illumia's heart clenched. The forest had never been breached before. It had always been too remote, too wild. But legends, she knew, had a way of traveling far beyond their origin, carried by tongues that twisted wonder into greed. Returning swiftly to Kaelir, Illumia's light flared faintly, a signal of warning. The deer's antlers dimmed as he lowered his head, a soft rumble escaping him. He was not afraid for himself, but for Illumia. He knew what humans could do, and how their hunger for light could blind them to the beauty they sought to capture. "They will come for you," Illumia said, her voice resolute, "but they will not take you, not while I breathe." Kaelir did not answer with words. He never did. But his gaze met hers, and in it she saw understanding. He trusted her, not as a guardian, but as a partner in a battle that would test them both. As the night deepened, the auroras faded, their brilliance replaced by a heavy stillness. Illumia perched on a high branch, her wings folding tightly against her back as she kept watch. Below her, Kaelir lay hidden among the roots of the great tree, his antlers dim to avoid catching the light. The forest held its breath, and the silence grew louder. The footprints had been only the beginning. Illumia could feel it now. The hunters were drawing closer. Their presence was a disturbance, a scar against the harmony she and Kaelir had always known. But the bond they shared was luminous. And though the shadows approached, Illumia knew one thing with certainty. The light was not so easily extinguished. The snow fell in whispers now, as if the sky itself sought to muffle its voice. Illumia crouched in the crook of a branch, her pale wings drawn close. The air below her was heavier than before, burdened by the weight of unseen eyes and the malice they carried. She could sense them, the hunters, moving with unnatural precision through the forest, their every step a disruption in the symphony of the woods. Kaelir lay hidden beneath the sheltering roots of the ancient tree, his luminous coat muted, a shadow of its former brilliance. He was still, his breathing shallow and deliberate, as though he too understood the need to mask his presence. Illumia's gaze flickered toward him, a silent promise passing between them. She would not let them take him. The first shadow emerged like an ink stain on the snow, a tall figure cloaked in furs, their breath a phantom cloud that dissipated into the frigid air. Illumia's sharp eyes caught the gleam of metal in the figure's hands, a crossbow, its bolts tipped with something that shimmered unnaturally, as though it bore magic meant to harm creatures of light. Behind the hunter, another figure loomed, this one shorter, broader, and carrying a net glinting with strange woven strands. Illumia's heart clenched. The net was no ordinary snare. It was enchanted steel, a material that could bind even the wind. She had heard of such tools in ancient tales, but never had she imagined they would one day trespass into her forest. The hunters moved slowly, their boots crunching softly against the snow, their eyes scanning the shadows. They spoke in low murmurs, their voices harsh and alien in the stillness of the woods. "Closer than we thought," one of them said, his voice as sharp as the wind slicing through the trees. "The tracks are fresh. We're near." Illumia tightened her grip on the branch, her tiny hands trembling with a mixture of fury and fear. They were too close. She could not wait for them to find Kaelir. She had to act. She stretched her wings and whispered a command to the forest, her voice carried on the threads of magic that bound her to this realm. The trees stirred, their branches creaking like old bones. Snow cascaded from above, falling in sudden blinding flurries. The hunters paused, their movements halting as they scanned the swirling white veil. Illumia darted through the air, a pale blur against the chaos she had summoned. She flew low, brushing the ground with her wings, leaving faint trails of light that danced like phantom footsteps. The hunters, seeing the glow, followed without hesitation. "Did you see that?" one of them hissed, his eyes narrowing as he pointed toward the faint glimmers disappearing into the distance. "A trick," the other muttered, though he followed nonetheless. Illumia led them deeper into the forest, weaving a path through the dense underbrush where the snow grew heavier and the trees leaned closer, their branches knitting together into a web. She knew this part of the forest well. It was the winding glade, a maze of trails known only to her and Kaelir. The hunters, for all their cunning, would find themselves ensnared. But hunters are not so easily deceived. Illumia heard it before she saw it. The faint snap of a trap, hidden beneath the snow. The sound reverberated through the stillness, freezing her mid-flight. Her wings fluttered erratically as her eyes darted to the ground below. A jagged steel contraption lay exposed, its teeth glinting with malice. She realized too late the depth of their cunning. A second shadow rose from behind her, silent and swift. She felt the cold grip of a net before she saw it, its strands searing against her light. The enchantment was strong, stronger than anything she had encountered. Pain lanced through her tiny form as the net tightened, its weight dragging her to the ground. Illumia's cry shattered the silence, a sound of anguish and defiance that carried through the forest. The hunters grinned, their victory all but certain. But their triumph was short-lived. Far off, hidden beneath the ancient tree, Kaelir stirred. His ears twitched at Illumia's cry, his luminous eyes snapping open. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for his response. Then, with a single fluid motion, he rose to his feet, his crystalline antlers catching the faintest glimmers of starlight. Kaelir moved with purpose, his hooves barely touching the ground as he ran toward Illumia. His light, though dimmed, began to grow, spreading through the trees like the first breath of dawn. The hunters turned, their eyes widening as the forest itself seemed to shift around them. The trees groaned and bent, their branches reaching toward the intruders as if seeking to entangle them. Kaelir's approach was a silent warning, a promise that the balance they had disturbed would not be so easily undone. The moon had risen to its zenith, casting its pale, unforgiving light upon the forest. The snow, once pristine, now bore the scars of trespass, a tangle of footprints and drag marks where Illumia had fallen. The hunters stood over her, their faces shadowed, but their triumph visible in the predatory glint of their eyes. The enchanted net coiled tightly around her, its strands burning faintly as they resisted her light. Illumia lay still, her wings crushed beneath the weight of the trap. Her breaths came shallow, each one laced with pain, but her mind raced. She could feel the hunter's greed, thick and cloying, saturating the air around her. She knew they did not seek her. She was but a small prize compared to the creature they truly wanted. "Where is it?" one hunter growled, his voice low and coarse. He crouched beside her, his gloved hand gripping the edge of the net. "The deer. We know you guard it, fairy." Illumia's eyes burned with defiance, pale flames in the cold night. She said nothing. Silence was her shield, her refusal to yield even as her strength waned. The second hunter, taller and quieter, stepped forward, his movements calculated. In his hands was a talisman carved from bone, its surface etched with runes that pulsed faintly. He held it aloft, and the forest seemed to recoil. Illumia flinched as the talisman's power rippled through her, disrupting the threads of magic that connected her to the woods. "It's close," the quiet hunter murmured, his gaze scanning the shadows. "The forest is restless. It's protecting him." Kaelir stood just beyond the clearing, hidden among the thick underbrush. His silver coat was muted, blending into the pale light of the snow. But his antlers shimmered faintly, betraying his presence to the keen-eyed. He could see Illumia, her small form struggling against the cruel net, and his chest tightened with a mix of fear and resolve. For a moment, he hesitated. His instinct was to flee, to lead the hunters away from her, but he knew she would not survive if left behind. Their bond, forged over years of silent understanding, was stronger than fear. Kaelir took a step forward, his hooves making no sound against the snow. Illumia's senses flickered, her connection to the forest dim but not entirely severed. She felt Kaelir's presence before she saw him, a gentle, familiar warmth on the edge of her awareness. Her heart leaped in equal parts hope and dread. "No," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost swallowed by the night. "Stay hidden." But Kaelir did not heed her silent plea. The hunters saw him before Illumia could act, their heads snapping toward the faint glimmer of his antlers. "There!" the first hunter shouted, his voice sharp with triumph. He snatched his crossbow, the bolt already notched and aimed. Kaelir moved, a blur of starlight and shadow. The bolt whistled past him, embedding itself in a tree with a dull thud. The hunters cursed, their movements frantic as they scrambled to reposition. Illumia seized the moment. Summoning what little strength remained, she reached deep within herself, calling to the ancient magic of the forest. Though her light was dim, it flickered with fierce determination. Snow swirled around her captors, rising like a spectral mist. The talisman's pulse faltered as her magic pushed back against its oppressive force. "Now!" she breathed, her voice a command carried on the wind. Kaelir understood. He charged into the clearing, his antlers blazing with sudden brilliance. The light was not warm but sharp, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The hunters cried out, shielding their eyes as Kaelir's radiance overwhelmed them. But the hunters were not so easily undone. The taller one, his face twisted in a snarl, raised the talisman high. Its runes flared with desperate intensity, and the snow around him melted in an instant, revealing the steel jaws of another trap hidden beneath. Kaelir, blinded by his own brilliance, stepped directly into it. The trap snapped shut with a sickening finality, its teeth biting deep into his leg. Illumia's scream pierced the air, a sound of pure anguish that seemed to stop time itself. The hunters regained their composure, their victory now all but assured. The forest shuddered as if in mourning. Kaelir stood frozen, his light flickering as blood stained the snow beneath him. Illumia, still bound, struggled harder, her magic surging wildly against the net. The hunters approached, their faces alight with greed and determination. At last one of them murmured, reaching toward Kaelir's antlers with trembling hands. But something stirred in the darkness, a deeper shadow beneath the trees. The forest, silent for so long, began to hum, a low and resonant sound that seemed to rise from the very earth. Illumia felt it first, a surge of power unlike anything she had known. This was not her doing. The light within Kaelir did not fade. It grew. The forest trembled, its stillness unraveling into motion. Trees groaned as their roots writhed beneath the snow, weaving into gnarled patterns that encircled the clearing. Above, the moon hung heavy and spectral, its light filtering through a veil of frost-laden mist. The hunters, poised on the brink of triumph, faltered. Something ancient stirred in the bones of the woods, something older than their greed and deeper than their understanding. Kaelir, though trapped, stood tall, his luminous eyes fixed on Illumia. His breath rose in clouds, each exhalation heavier than the last. The crystalline antlers atop his head flickered weakly, their radiance dimmed by pain. Yet even in this moment of despair, he did not bow. Illumia, bound within the enchanted net, felt the pulse of the forest shift. The hum that had begun as a whisper now swelled, rising into a symphony of power. It was a language of the land, a primal song that resonated with every branch, stone, and snowflake. She closed her eyes and let it fill her, her small body trembling as the magic flowed into her veins. The hunter sensed the change but did not understand it. The taller one, clutching the talisman, raised it high again, its runes flaring with a desperate light. "Hold the deer!" he barked, his voice sharp with command. "This forest is nothing but tricks. Bind it before it can escape." The shorter hunter lunged toward Kaelir, his net poised to ensnare the magnificent creature fully. But as his hand reached out, the forest struck. Branches whipped downward like serpents, their movements swift and alive. One struck the hunter's arm, sending the net spiraling to the ground. Another coiled around his legs, dragging him backward into the shadows. He screamed, the sound cutting through the clearing, before being swallowed by the woods. The taller hunter turned, his eyes wild as he watched his companion vanish. "What is this sorcery?" he snarled, clutching the talisman tighter. Illumia's voice rose from where she lay, soft yet unyielding. "It is the forest reclaiming what is its own. You do not belong here." Kaelir's light began to change. No longer the gentle shimmering glow of starlight, it became fierce, jagged, and unrelenting. The auroras above, drawn by his power, surged into life, painting the sky with bands of violent green and red. The clearing was bathed in their light, the snow catching the colors and reflecting them like fire. The trap around Kaelir's leg hissed as the light grew hotter, its enchanted steel glowing red. The tall hunter stumbled back, shielding his face as the heat seared through the air. Illumia's wings twitched. The magic of the forest surged within her, and she reached out, her small fingers trembling as she grasped the strands of the net binding her. They burned against her touch, but she did not stop. The light within her swelled, and with a cry of defiance, she tore the net apart, its enchantment unraveling like threads in the wind. Freed, she rose into the air, her wings blazing with newfound strength. She flew to Kaelir, her hands alighting on the trap. The deer's eyes met hers, and in that gaze, they shared an unspoken vow. "I am with you," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of eternity. Together their light erupted. It was not a single burst, but a dance. A rhythm of power that wove through the clearing like a living thing. The auroras above mirrored their movements, spiraling downward in tendrils of flame-like light. The forest sang in harmony, its voice rising to join theirs. The taller hunter fell to his knees, his talisman cracking under the weight of their combined radiance. He looked up, his face pale with awe and terror as the light enveloped him. "What are you?" he gasped. Kaelir did not answer. The light surged again, and the hunter screamed as the forest claimed him, his shadow fading into the snow. When the clearing fell silent, Kaelir stood unharmed, the trap that had held him now nothing more than molten steel pooling in the snow. Illumia hovered beside him, her wings dimming as the magic ebbed. She was exhausted, her small frame trembling with the effort it had taken. But she did not falter. The auroras lingered above them, their colours softer now, their glow a quiet reminder of what had been protected. "We did it," Illumia said softly, her voice barely audible. Kaelir lowered his head, his antlers brushing against hers in a gesture of gratitude. They stood together in the silence, two beings bound by light and trust, their bond stronger than ever before. Far off, the forest whispered its approval, its ancient voice weaving into the wind. The hunters had been repelled, but Illumia and Kaelir knew the shadows might return. For now, though, the light reigned supreme. The forest of Everfrost had returned to silence, but it was no longer the silence of stillness. It was a quiet thrumming, a resonance that echoed through roots and snowdrifts, as though the land itself were catching its breath. Above, the auroras shimmered with a soft, ethereal glow, their colours weaving across the heavens in gentle waves. The battle was over, but the air still felt heavy with what had passed. Kaelir stood in the clearing, his silver coat dusted with blood and ice, though the light in his antlers remained undiminished. Beside him, Illumia hovered, her wings faintly flickering as exhaustion weighed on her small frame. Despite her weariness, she exuded a quiet strength, her pale eyes scanning the forest for any lingering danger. There was none. The hunters were gone, driven back into the shadows from which they had come. Their greed and malice had been swallowed by the forest, leaving no trace but the scars they had carved into the snow. Kaelir stepped forward, his movement slow but deliberate. The melted steel of the trap still glistened on the ground, a dark reminder of the pain he had endured. His leg, though healed by the light they had summoned together, trembled slightly as he walked. Illumia followed, her hands brushing gently against his side, her touch soothing. "You are hurt," she said softly, her voice as delicate as frost on a window pane. Kaelir did not answer, as he never did, but his luminous eyes met hers, conveying a quiet reassurance. He lowered his head, his antlers catching the faintest glimmers of starlight, and the auroras above seemed to pulse in response. "It will take time," Illumia murmured, understanding his silence. "But you will heal. We both will." The forest around them seemed to stir, its ancient presence wrapping around the pair like a protective shroud. The trees, which had bent and twisted in defense, now stood tall again, their branches reaching skyward in reverence. The snow fell once more, soft and unbroken, erasing the marks of the battle. Illumia gazed upward, her pale wings shimmering faintly in the auroral glow. "The light is stronger now," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Not because of me, or even you, but because of what we became together." Kaelir lifted his head, his antlers blazing with a sudden brilliance. The auroras surged in response, their colors deepening, their movements quickening. The sky itself seemed alive, weaving patterns of emerald and violet that danced across the stars. Illumia felt the pulse of the light within her, its rhythm now intertwined with her own heartbeat. She had always been a guardian, but in this moment, she realized she was no longer merely a protector of a Kaelir. She was a part of him, as he was of her. Two beings bound by a force older than the forest itself. As the auroras reached their peak, the clearing was bathed in their glow, every tree and shadow illuminated by the celestial dance. Illumia and Kaelir stood at its heart, their figures small against the vastness of the sky, but radiating a power that defied their size. "The hunters will return," Illumia said quietly, though there was no fear in her voice. "Others will hear of this place, of you. They will come with greed in their hearts, seeking to take what does not belong to them." Kaelir did not move, but his light grew steadier, a silent promise that he would be ready. "And when they come," Illumia continued, her wings unfurling, "we will meet them, not with fear, but with the light they cannot understand." The auroras began to soften, their colors fading into the pale glow of approaching dawn. The forest settled into a deep stillness, its wounds already beginning to heal. Illumia turned to Kaelir, her gaze steady. "You are more than a creature of legend," she said, "and I am more than a fairy. Together, we are the keepers of the light, protectors of a balance that cannot be broken." Kaelir lowered his head, his antlers brushing against hers, their connection a silent vow. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the horizon, the auroras faded completely, leaving the sky a pale, empty canvas. Kaelir and Illumia disappeared into the forest, their forms dissolving into the shadows of the trees. Yet their presence lingered, woven into the very fabric of the land. From that day forward, the forest of Everfrost became more than a place. It became a story. Travelers spoke of the silver deer who summoned the northern lights, and the fairy who guarded him with her life. They spoke of a bond forged in starlight, of a light that could never be extinguished. But the forest, for all its whispered tales, kept its true secrets close. Only the stars above and the earth below knew the full truth of Illumia and Kaelir, of the light they had summoned, and of the eternity they shared beneath the northern lights. And so the legend lived on, carried by the winds and written in the heavens, a promise that no matter the darkness, the light would always endure.